So I've called it the deficit model in pedagogy, and in a way I'm touching on some of the issues that Rubin raised and also have been raised earlier. And I hope I can get clear to you the content of what I'm saying, because I've got some very dense slides, so I'll try and skip over some of them. And this is kind of a work in progress, but I've been thinking about some of these issues for quite a while. But first of all, I'm introducing more standard stuff to do with my application of Brandom, or drawing on the resources Brandom makes available to think about pedagogy. So the things that I want to try and cover was starting with Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, and what I'm taking from that, apart from an attack on a given, is a sense of self-determination and activity. And we have this awkward word, agency. It's not really ideal, but one of my concerns is a neglect of the agency of learners, and that was one of the things that Rubin touched on using Fore. I draw on Brandom's inferentialism, not in ways that he would necessarily go along with, but to illuminate issues of pedagogy, because I think he provides fantastic resources for thinking about things that we're not thinking about at the moment. I want to touch on very briefly an extension of how to think about inferentialism from a kind of critical engagement that Stephen Levine's made with Brandom, and also mentioning something about Vygotsky, and then going back to the early 70s, where Nell Keddy was famous for critiquing what she called a deficit model of learners, in terms of seeing them as culturally deprived. And so all this relates to agency. How do we see a learner when they come into a room? Do we see them as inadequate and needing to be developed? We may have rejected the filling their heads up with something, but we still have a sense that we're bringing learners and initiating them into a domain that they're not already aware of. And then the final thing, which I may not fully get to, is what I think Sebastian Rodel would call true materialism, and Backhurst picks up on this as well elsewhere, which would involve fully recognizing agency understood in terms of our distinctive life form. So, rushing through. So most of you will be familiar with this famous first point in the thesis on Feuerbach, where he says the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of an object or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human practice. So the question here is, what do we mean by sensuous human practice, and what implication does that have for how we think about a lot of the other matters philosophically or practically? So Marx's conceptualization of materialism is pivotal. He challenges the dualism of material ideal, and instead bringing to the fore sensuous human activity. Central to my discussion is the sui generis character of human activity, the distinctive human life form or species being. And this is a very complicated area. There's a big literature on it to explain what does this actually mean. I know it's touched on a little when Kirill was talking about the architect and the bee, but there's so much more to getting a grip on what this means, whether it's an Aristotelian understanding of life form or what Marx himself meant by species being. So my argument is this is overlooked, this is completely ignored in our educational practices, and such neglect leads to an adherence to a myth of the given and a form of empiricism that fails to acknowledge that humans as beings responsive to reason, what McDowell describes as a good gloss on one notion of freedom. So some of you will be familiar with this. Contemporary education, there are ferocious debates going on between normally governments who want facts to be taught to students and teachers who are concerned with how do you get somebody to get a grip on a fact? How do you give them epistemic access? And also wanting the students to have some agency, wanting them to be involved in making meaning in some way. Rubin went as far as to say, transforming together something using Fore. So one of the things that Brandom brings out is the issue with representationalism. And sorry if I'm rushing through this a bit so I can get on to the key points. In attempting to recognise the rational capacities of students, too often meaning is assumed to be directly conveyed via representations, whether it's names, symbols, artefacts, or pictures. So there's a givenness which is captured in what Charles Taylor called the designative approach to meaning. So there's a particular kind of common sense conception of meaning that underlies a lot of educational practice. And what Brandom does, I think, so well is privileges the inferential over the representational. So central to Brandom's work is the argument that an account of meaning needs to privilege inference over representation. In a way, when Adam Toome was talking about Cartesianism, he talked about it both as like a template where you just kind of map it onto the world and that's how you describe things, but you can also use it heuristically as a metaphor. So that's using it in a more inferential, active way. And Brandom says, Hegel completed the inversion of the traditional order of semantic explanation begun by Kant by beginning with the concept of experience as inferential activity and discussing the making of judgments and the development of concepts entirely in terms of the roles they play in that inferential activity. So this is, for me, getting towards the area of putting human beings at their fore, their self-determination and their agency in sensuous human activity. You're prioritizing that over the representation. So Brandom has some lovely examples where we can think about the difference between reasons or causes. For a machine, for example, a thermostat that responds to an increase in temperature by switching off, we would understand the action is merely the outcome of a causal process when the thermostat goes off. But for humans, the act of switching off cannot be understood simply in causal terms. The human's response involves and requires reasons and awareness of what follows from being hot, i.e. what the concept of hot means. And it's this distinction that's often ignored or not given sufficient credence in educational practice. And I'm primarily talking about schooling rather than higher education, but obviously these kinds of things can extend through all sectors of education. So Brandom asks, what is a knower able to do that the thermostat cannot? After all, they may respond differentially to just the same range of stimuli, me switching the thermostat off or it switching itself off, depending on where it's been set. And he says the knower has the practical know-how to situate the response in a network of inferential relations to tell what follows from something being cold, what would be evidence for it, and what would be incompatible with it, and so on. And this is something that, Brandom wouldn't say this, but even a pre-linguistic child can become responsive to, can begin to have some awareness of. So by drawing on the resources available in inferentialism, we can bring to light just those aspects of this process of representation which are significant for educationalists concerned with how learners grasp concepts. And it confronts the question of precisely what that grasping comprises. And what it means is we can begin to give attention to how people are using concepts. Obviously, this is a kind of standard thing in teaching. You should be thinking about how your learners are using their concepts. But Brandom gives all sorts of resources for thinking about this, not only deontic scorekeeping and dialogue, but also recognizing that in order to use a concept, you've committed yourself to certain norms if you're applying it in a particular way. And as a result of your commitments, certain entitlements will follow. So here's an example from education. 14-year-olds in a lesson. If we had time, I'd just ask you, what kind of lesson do you think it is? And the children, the teacher is aware of the issue of epistemic access. They're worried about how their learners are not going to get completely bored with this lesson. And so they're trying to make it lively for them and they're trying to get them actively thinking about meaning. So they've asked them, and it's an RE lesson, and in this country, you teach many different religions in religious education, and you might just have one lesson on the Bible. So this was the lesson for the 14-year-olds. And they had an activity, choose a topic, make your own Bible. So people made car Bibles, fashion Bibles, but make sure you include, and they're trying to get them to use the concepts in the Bible, proverbs, letters, laws, prophecy, or parables. Now, the lovely thing about this example is you can see the way the children have used those concepts does very much reflect their commitments. And from their commitments, certain entitlements will follow. And those entitlements will not be in the domain of theology or reading a religious text. They're to do with consumer society. They're about predictions about shops going bust or rules about what kind of clothes you can wear. So in a way, they're not in a religious education lesson. The teacher hasn't brought them into the domain where there's sufficient normative constraint for them to be functioning so that they're beginning to develop an understanding of concepts within religion. So it's very much like if I want to teach you the concept of force, if it's in a physics lesson, it's functioning differently to if I'm teaching it in a literary lesson where we're talking about the force of destiny. Same word, but functioning in a different way. And that's what the teachers need to be aware of. But because we're in a representationalist paradigm, the dominance of representations wins over, instead of the agency of the learner in terms of recognizing their commitments and their entitlements. So without the relevant norms being made available to the student, the use they make of particular concepts, which demonstrate the particular inferential connections to other concepts that they are committed to, so in that case it was all to do with consumer society or what you might expect teenagers to be most involved in, will not be governed by the standards of correctness of the subject domain they are studying. So in a sense, they're not being brought into that subject domain because the teacher hasn't been attentive to the norms. And so Branham says, the laws of nature bind us by compulsion. If the ceiling starts falling down, we're compelled. We can't wish it to go back up again. But the institution of authority is human work. We bind ourselves to norms. So we assent to the norms that are already in existence. This is something that may have been missing a bit to recognize this agency again. The norms are there about how you should sit and not talk while I'm talking. But you've assented to them, and you could not assent. You could start talking to your neighbour and disrupt my talk. And you have that capacity. The norms are there for you to respond to. And McDowell makes a slightly different point. He argues, he extends what he takes from Sellers, and he says a normative context is not necessary just for knowledge. It's necessary for the idea of being in touch with the world at all, whether knowledgeably or not. And again, I think that was something coming out in Kirill's talk when he was talking about how the child understands the spoon, the normative context of the spoon. Vygotsky picks up on Marx and says science would be unnecessary if the form of a manifestation and the essence of things coincided directly. That would be a representationalism. You have the form and it matches the world. But instead, the nature of things is disclosed not in direct contemplation of a single object or another. So often teachers just have to spend all their time trying to get contemplation of a single object across to the students. But actually, what's needed is the connections and relations that are manifested in the movement and development of the object, and these connect it to the rest of reality. The internal connections of things is disclosed with the help of thinking in concepts. So concepts are like a tool that can open up something for us. For to develop a concept of some object means to disclose a series of connections and relations of the object with the rest of reality and include it in a complex system of phenomena. So this is very close to Branham and not surprising because Vygotsky was also influenced by Hegel. And he says a concept is the result of rational processing of our existence. It's mediated knowledge of the object. When a child's learning a concept from a teacher, it's not a static picture of the world. It's a rational processing where it's mediated, it's dynamic. To think of some object with the help of a concept means to include the object in a complex system of mediating connections and relations disclosed in the determination of concepts. And this is one of the reasons why Vygotsky says, When a concept is first learnt, the development of its meaning has only just begun. For any of us who've learnt technical concepts, philosophical concepts, we've learnt them and we've got some hold on them, we can redefine them, but we come to understand their meaning over a number of years when we appreciate how those concepts function, how they developed. But what is meant then by an exercise of reason, what Vygotsky in translation calls rational processing? I'm interested in the Russian, it also is rational processing, which sounds very mechanistic. Pedagogic issues demand understanding through the lens of life activities rather than purely intellectual terms. And this is something that Rubin was touching on. I would have a different approach to how he's reading Brandom. But the point is that I'm coming back to the thesis on Feuerbach, sensuous human activity. You know, understanding how we get a grip on meaning through that, not some intellectualist mapping of meanings in some way. This is a very regularly used example from Hard Times, often in educational circles. It's picked up as an illustration. I won't read it all out, but the story is Sissy Jupe, the poor girl in this nasty teacher's classroom, spends all her life with horses. She obviously has an enormous sense of horses. Even Gradgrind, the horrible teacher, says, well, you're, you know, kind of almost ironically, your father's a veterinary surgeon, a farrier, and a horsebreaker. You know, he's saying all the things her father does with horses. But then he says to the girl, define what a horse is to me. And when the girl can't, he then asks the boy, and the boy says quadruped, gramivore, whatever it is, 40 teeth, namely 24 grinders, 4 eye teeth, 12 incisors. And then he says, that's what a horse is, girl number 20. So isn't that crazy that, you know, she's the one who knows what horses is, but he knows nothing, but can reel off a definition. I want to use that to get into Steve Levine's kind of engagement with Brandom. Obviously, he recognises the great value of Brandom's work. Have I lost a microphone? Yes, I have. I noticed a difference. So Steve Levine is engaging with Brandom and really rates a lot of what he's doing, but he wants to push him in a Deweyan direction. He wants to get him to think about actions, not just what could be or could risk being called intellectualism. I don't think it is intellectualism because I don't think Brandom is ignoring the world when he's talking about language and dialogue. Just going to hold it. But Levine challenges Brandom, arguing that he's not entitled to a view in which reasons reach all the way out of performance, because performances, i.e. the performances that Sissy Jupe can do when she's working with horses, due to his two-ply account. So this is a quote from Brandom that Levine picks up. Response dispositions are characterizable in naturalistic, physicalist vocabulary and immense capture the capacity we genuine knowers share with artifacts and nearly sentient creatures. So on the one hand, Brandom's making a very stark separation between machines and merely sentient creatures. But on the other hand, when it comes to actions, Levine's saying there's more for him to do here. It's not adequate, his account. He wants to argue instead that rational commitment is manifest in bodily action itself. McDowell does something a bit like this in the Dreyfus debate that he has, the debate with Dreyfus, when he reminds Dreyfus that when a tennis player hits the ball perfectly or a footballer or any other skillful activity, that there has been a whole lot of conceptualization and reasoning going on prior to that immediate automatic act. But Levine says if one is to hold that bodily action itself is a social reasoning and the commitment it results in must manifest in bodily action itself, bodily action is not a response to an antecedent exercise of reason. This is the crucial thing again, no sideways on view. You're back in the sensuous activity of human beings. It is a manifestation of it. It's not an antecedent exercise, not something that follows reasoning, but it's actually a manifestation of the reasoning. So Levine wants to replace Brandam's rationalistic brand of pragmatism with a more classical kind, one in which intentional action is essentially embedded in bodily habits and skills. And in that sense, Sissy Jupe knows an enormous amount. She's got a lot of actions and sensitivities and responsiveness to reasons in a sense. So Levine's alternative model of action, he argues in a quite complex and detailed paper that Brandam's worried about, the reason he's got this two-stage model is he wants to avoid a myth of the given in the action. He doesn't want there to be any givenness in that. But Levine argues we can avoid the myth of the given by recognizing that the capacities that make actions possible, i.e. the ability to reason practically and to act on bodily habits, are acquired capacities that are relatively plastic, i.e. they develop over time. On this view, there's nothing that can be practically efficacious that is prior to a process of habituation, learning, and concept formation, nothing that can meet the independence condition by simply being given. So as I said, he's seeing actions as manifestations of intellect and of reasoning. So coming back to my worry as an educationalist, in my own work worrying about this, whether I've got a deficit model of the learner when I'm applying or trying to apply resources that I'm taking and perhaps misusing or applying from Brandam. This classic book, many years ago, classic collection by Nell Keddy, called Tinker Tailor, The Myth of Cultural Deprivation, takes issue with the idea of cultural deprivation. She argues that instead it's the processes and structures of schooling that prevent children's reasoning capacities being exercised. You know, it's the assessment procedures, it's the way the classrooms are laid out, it's the minimal capacity for dialogue with teachers because they're so busy trying to shove knowledge into you. So she's saying all of that is why we see learners as culturally deprived, you know, why they end up being characterized in that way. As Sissy Jupe would have been seen by Gradgrind. She credits learners with fully actualized capacities of reasoning. So this is important. The reasoning is there anyway. It doesn't matter who the human being is. It doesn't matter. They've had life experience. It doesn't matter whether they've been in school or in other contexts. And finds the system of schooling wanting in the perverse conditions that prevent these capacities being exercised. That's the issue. Are teachers creating the conditions where learners that are labelled as culturally deprived have this possibility to exercise their capacities? So, as I've already read that first bit, but this is the crucial thing. McDowell is well known for this idea that through initiation into language, children are brought into a store of historically accumulated wisdom about what is a reason for what, and they thereby acquire the capacity to think and act. So Keddy wants to say, no, they've got the capacity to think and act. It's not, and that's something that's there in the species being, in the life form. So this is the final bit. I'll try and finish very quickly now. So another aspect I'm interested in following and want to pursue it further is Sebastian Rodel's work, where he wrote a very interesting response to David Backhurst, rating David Backhurst's book, The Formation of Reason, but taking issue with one fundamental idea which relates to species being. He says, because McDowell says, it's not even clearly intelligible to suppose that a creature might be born at home in the space of reasons. Human beings are not. They are born mere animals, and they're transformed into thinkers and intentional agents in the course of coming to maturity. And Rodel says, the child is born with this is how he's saying McDowell is seeing things. The child is born with first nature, which is biological and individual. It equips the child with animal powers, feeling, desire, and perception. Receiving education, the child acquires a second nature, which is social and historical. It equips the child with personal powers, thought and reason, intellect and will. By the way, when he says receiving education, McDowell's not talking about education in the way that David Backhurst is in his book, The Formation of Reason. McDowell's talking about initiation into language, which is slightly different, although in a broad definition of education, it would be part of it. So Rodel says, I contend that the idea of a change from an animal to a person is incoherent. Consequently, education is not the agent of such change. Reason is not impressed upon the child as a second nature. It is already present as a character of its first nature. Education, instead of being the source of reason in the child, is the source of habits of reason in the child. And this not only does not exclude it entails that reason is actual only as a social historical form. And that's exactly what David Backhurst is arguing. For reason is actual only in habits. I will skip over this because what happens is that Backhurst challenges Rodel over habits because he wants to argue that what he's talking about in the Vygotskian account is not habits in the sense that Backhurst is using it. And in Levine's discussion, he also is talking about a deflationary or an inflationary conception of habits. So a lot relies on how we're conceptualizing action. So this is a bit where Backhurst rejects the Wittgensteinian concept of training. It fails to capture the complexity of the initiation. Children gradually catch on or internalize the normative structures that define the contours of the world. And I think that would be very close to what Kirill was saying in his talk. By considering these matters in Aristotelian as opposed to psychological fashion, though, Rodel is able to maintain that education, instead of being the source of reason in the child, is the source of habits of reason in the child. For reason is actual only in habits. This returns us to a picture of the idea of reason as the very opposite of a detached or disembodied form. That is to say, reason is actual in the human being and can only be actual in the human being as a social and historical reality. So again, this is touching on this very complex idea of life form of the human being, or species, what Marx would call species being. So just to end, all of this is trying to get a grip on how we're talking about reason. What is this reason that we're talking about? I'm trying to argue that Keddy's quite right to alert us to a deficit model of the learner. All learners have reason. They're all reasoning, just like Sissy Jupe is reasoning. But she may not be able to explicitly articulate her reasoning, but that reasoning is part of her species being, part of being a human being. And McDowell pushes us, he talks about liberalizing our conception of reason. He says, it is not rationalism as such that is blamed for conceptions of human life, from which such things as self-legislating wills are absent. This is the self-determination, the agency of human beings. If a particular version of rationalism saddles itself with a pinched and shallow conception of reason as the mark of a distinctively human way of living, it's not surprising that the result is a pinched and shallowed conception of human life and personhood. And the remedy is not to abandon rationalism, but to liberalize our conception of reason. So what I was trying to get across is that in our education system, we unfortunately have a pinched and shallow conception of reason. We're not so far away from Gradgrind's position. And we need to think more about what this means, this sensuous human life activity, which is transformative. Okay, thank you.
Because I know that you will love this, Jan. So you're completely right to pick out rationally processing as the Vygotsky translation. I would translate it as rationally working through.
Oh, lovely, yeah. I thought the processing fitted too much with information processing, which is what he's completely at odds with. And I thought, oh, that must be one of those dire translations of his work. But I don't read the Russian to know better.
It's hard for me to see how, for Gödel, I will just speak as loudly as I can. It's hard for me to see, for Gödel, how reason is not just an innate ability that human beings have. If that's his view, then I don't see why with him we are still having like a kind of socially progressive view instead of a view that looks a lot like historical versions of, for example, Cartesianism, or maybe even more so, Aquinas' view of human beings, right? As you know, humans, specifically human beings, what's specific of them is that they have an intellectual soul, and that sounds like that is a lot like what Gödel is talking about there, or at least I find it difficult to see.
Yeah, so we have a problem because we always think of innate or nurtured. You know, we have that kind of, it goes back to Adam Doome's metaphors that we're working with when we think about things. And I think when we talk about species being in Marx's sense, it means something different to that, and it's much more complicated. And that's where I think the Aristotelianism comes in, both for Gödel but also for Marx. Because just like the acorn grows into the oak tree if it lands on fertile soil and it gets some water or whatever, the human has the potential of reason. It has that already in its first nature. It's not something that comes into it from outside. It's got that. But that comes about in the social formations that we humans live in. Or you could go into the kind of Hegelian argument about personhood and I and thou. We are universal. We attend to things in universal terms, not in terms of the immediacy of any particular environment or stimulus. And that's an aspect of what it is to be human. That is a characteristic of the human life form. It's not something that education is expected to sort out. And a lot of the time, it denies that in all the people that have failed in the education system. It denies that that's there. They're just seen as lacking in responsiveness to reasons.
I understand that, but I feel like Descartes and Aquinas could say exactly the same thing. So for Descartes, we are born with an innate reason. I understand the point, right? Reason is an ability, it's not a state, it's not a soul kind of thing, right? It's the ability to use reason correctly that we are born with, that isn't actualized. But Descartes says that too, right? Is that we are born with an immaterial soul, we have the capacity for intellectual representations. However, we don't use it because we are tied to the body. We are educated badly, actually. That's a big part of Descartes' philosophy. And we are subject to the prejudices of our culture.
But the Cartesianism doesn't have, we shouldn't pursue this too much, but it doesn't have a conception of the life form of the species being, you know, when you're giving that account. And that's the change, you know, that you get with Marx and also in Hegel, in, you know, to a great degree.
I just wanted to bring together these two moments of this excellent talk kind of non-sequentially. But first of all, second of all, you talked about Tinker Tailor and this idea of cultural deprivation, and I suppose chiming with the first talk in this panel, the kind of lack of dialogue which students, school students are often getting. But very early on in this talk, you have this remarkable passage where one of the laws put in place is that you shouldn't wear a crop top if you're old. Old, of course, meaning over 30, like the very idea of a 31-year-old wearing a crop top gets 2 exclamation marks. And I think you're totally right in saying that this is a clear-cut example of commitments. But also my question, I suppose, is this also sort of checking, there's a kind of process of checking in that teachers always have to do inevitably that we could see in inferential terms as sort of deontic scorekeeping, right? Where we have to, the teacher has to not only ensure that the students are parroting back phrases they've heard 100 times, so they say, oh, commitment, oh, law, you know, crop top. They have to actually have a applicability that has that distinctive personality around it, right?
And that's exactly the point. And sadly for the poor teacher, they've got a lesson where they've got to get through a whole load of material and get on to the next topic. So dialogue is, although you know, in a lot of education policy, the, you know, dialogue is stressed, but how often is there an opportunity for dialogue, even in higher education, let alone in you know, pre-higher education? And without that dialogue, you can't unpack what grip this student has got on a law, what a law means in the Bible compared with a kind of trivial rule about some item of clothing.
So total necessity, but also disposable in the process.
Sorry?
It's a necessity for teaching, but it's also
Yeah,
treating
but because, so my argument, I've written a paper critiquing cognitive load theory, which is very fashionable now and is totally reliant on a Cartesian conception of internal schema. And I've wanted to argue that the lack of ability to take the load can be dealt with by external support, not internal support. But this underlies education. So when people think about how to manage the education system or what kind of curricula to have or how to implement it, my argument is, like Brandon says, we're still inhabiting a representationalist paradigm. And we certainly haven't taken on the idea of Marx, which is rejecting a sideways-on view and saying, we're in the world. We are transforming the world. Our activities are reinforcing norms, or we're challenging norms, or whatever.